Let's make this into this. Hey folks, how are you? Pete, founder and chief nosh of Great American Nosh, where we live by the mantra, eat, drink, and savor. Fall again, here's my ode to fall. It's New England, pumpkins, colors. How about we make our own cider? When I was much younger, I used to overthink things. Now as I am mature and have learned and gotten wiser, I've learned it's a lot easier to keep it simple. So with cider, the cider that you get in the supermarket, the very important thing to understand is if you can make this into hard cider, is that it cannot have any preservatives in it. It has to be just pure apple juice that is pressed from the apples. A lot of cider that you're gonna find in the supermarket is gonna have potassium sorbate. It's great for drinking, and obviously, you know, the kids love the cider in the fridge and having it as a glass now and then. But when it comes to hard cider, it actually doesn't work because the yeast is inhibited from eating the sugar because of the potassium sorbate. There's the yeast, folks. This is the yeast we're going to use, actually. And, you know, you can actually use any kind of yeast. A lot of people use champagne yeast, special cider yeasts. In this case, I am using a cider yeast. It all comes down to what they call a term attenuation. Really, it's the percentage of how much sugar is left, how much sugar the yeast eats. No, nothing is 100% attenuation. The only problem is, a lot of times when I make apple cider, the yeast eats a lot of sugar. And that basically leaves you with a very dry cider. And I actually like my cider a little bit sweet, not too sweet, not like apple juice sweet. Now, because that the yeast is gonna stop at a certain amount of time, I always add a little bit extra sugar to overwhelm the yeast. And I typically will use a pound and a half of sugar per gallon of cider. In this case, we have 5 gallons of cider. So we are going to actually warm up one of these gallons. We're going to put in our sugar just to dissolve it. We're not going to boil it. We're just going to dissolve it. Then we're going to mix it in with the rest of the cider in the sanitized carboy. Now, what type of sugar are we going to use? I like to use honey. I love honey, but the problem is honey's really expensive. So I actually have turned into more of a brown sugar fan. So I am using a lot more brown sugar these days in my cider making. I only do cider once a year, folks. I only make 1 5-gallon batch and that's it. Again, don't overthink this cider. All we're doing is we're putting in sugar in a warm thing of cider, dissolving it enough, putting it in with the rest of the 4 gallons of cider, pitching our yeast, and we're done. That's it. And then eventually, in a few weeks, you're gonna get one of these. How about that? The other thing to remember, folks, about cider or home brewing of any type, or even winemaking, you gotta be clean. No dirty hands. Everything must be sanitized. Anything that's gonna touch your cider, your beer, your wine has to be clean. And that includes the air stopper, whatever. not this beer. Probably for a blooper reel right there. Anyway, and the other thing that I actually always recommend for cider or beer brewing, before you pitch your yeast, make sure your cider, beer, wine is actually at the temperature that yeast recommends in their range. So in this case, I left this cider out of the fridge for several hours to get to room temp, and also the yeast. So when the yeast actually does get introduced to that lovely little environment of all that sugar to eat, it's not gonna be cold, it's not gonna be too hot, it's gonna be just right. So chomp, 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 chomp. Mmm. Oh, hey folks. The thing with cider and beer making and wine making, you can make it as hard as you want or as simple as you want. This is for the folks who really want the simple version. But what about the alcohol level? We don't know what the alcohol level is. You know, I threw that stuff out years ago when I started making cider. You know what? It's good for a stat to throw out. Oh, I have a 10% ABV or a 9% ABV. You know what? I don't really care. I know it's going to have a lot of alcohol level in it. It's usually in the 8 to 12% range, no matter what my yeast plays out, how much sugar I have involved. Doesn't matter. As long as it tastes good, keep it simple, folks. Now that took all of 15 minutes to actually put that cider together. Now, I obviously had to get sanitize my equipment, but that's not a problem. You're just letting it soak. I basically stuck it in a dark corner, not gonna be disturbed. It's room temperature, about 70 to 72, and it's gonna probably ferment for 2 to 3 weeks. It won't be clear for a while. I mean, if you really want it to be clear, then you can get it filtered. I don't do the filtering, it's a pain in the ass. It's just for aesthetics, and I'm not submitting it into a competition. It's just for personal consumption for my friends, if they're good enough friends. Hopefully you enjoyed our version of Cider 101, Cider Making 101. Again, this is really simple. Just get a carboy. Obviously, if you don't, you can get a paint bucket with a little airlock on it and call it a day. Just make sure it's clean, and you get cider that is not treated with potassium sorbate or any kind of preservatives. Just gonna make sure it's pure apple juice. Always ask the proprietor of the orchard, if you do go to one, to make sure, because if not, the yeast will not work. And you're gonna have a really bad experiment, and you're gonna have to dump out 5 gallons of cider, which is a travesty. Eat, drink, savor!